In the US, William Ladd advocated a court of nations for the settlement of all international disputes by means of arbitration. A resolution to this effect was passed by the Senate of Massachusetts in 1837. Proposals for disarmament were circulated. 23. Victor Hugo. In 1843, the first worldwide peace convention was held in London, but was largely ridiculed. Nevertheless, 2,000 people attended. These international peace congresses were held every 2 years thereafter until the year 1853. The president of the 1849 Paris Congress was the famous French author Victor Hugo, who made an impassioned speech that looked forward to the future establishment of the United States of Europe. But then came the Crimean War in Europe and the American Civil War, so the peace movement declined for some years. 24. International utilities. In 1855, the first international utilities were established. For example, the International Telegraph Convention was signed that led to the formation of the Telegraphic Union in 1865. In 1874, the Universal Postal Union was created that guaranteed freedom of transit for mail services and set uniform rates for postage. Other treaties followed, covering many aspects of international communications, travel and commerce. 25. International interest groups. At the same time, many international interest groups sprang up. For example, an International Federation of Miners, an International Union of Woodworkers, etc. By 1914, there were some 450 non-government international organizations, NGOs, in existence. 26. Dunant, that's D-U-N-A-N-T. In 1863, the great Swiss philanthropist Jean-Henri Dunant founded the International Red Cross Association, and the first Geneva Convention was organized that established rules for the treatment of wounded soldiers in war and the protection of hospitals and medical personnel. Later conventions were held in 1906, dealing with rules for armed forces at sea, and again in 1929, dealing with the treatment of prisoners of war, and in 1949, dealing with the protection of civilians in war. Dunant was awarded the first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901 for his work. 27. Richard Bluntschli, that's B-L-U-N-T-S-C-H-L-I, sounds Swiss, and Lorimer, L-O-R-I-M-E-R. Codes of international law were established at around this time. For example, the House of Commons in Britain carried a motion in 1873 calling for a permanent system of international arbitration, moved by Henry Richard. Some elaborate proposals appeared, such as the draft code produced by Professor J.C. Bluntschli of Heidelberg, okay, so it's German, which ran to 862 articles, and the 2-volume work of Professor James Lorimer of Edinburgh, Scotland. To implement these codes, Bluntschli once more proposed a federation of European states, while Lorimer outlined a plan for international government. 28. Kramer and Passy. The first embryonic World Parliament, called the Inter-Parliamentary Union, was organized in 1886 by William Randall Kramer, C-R-E-M-E-R, a British Labour leader, together with Frédéric Passy, a French economist. So Frédéric Passy. It was composed of legislators from many countries and played a role in the Hague conferences, which followed soon after. In 1904, the Union formally proposed an international congress which should meet periodically to discuss international questions. 29. The Hague Conferences. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, convened the first Hague Conference in 1899. The aim was to limit the armaments that were building up at great expense, and to provide for peaceful settlement of international disputes. 26 nations met at the first conference in 1899 and 44 at the second conference in 1907. Little was accomplished, although a permanent court of arbitration that later became the World Court was set up at The Hague to provide optional arbitration of disputes. Some 13 conventions were adopted to revise some of the customs and laws of war to eliminate unnecessary suffering. The conferences failed to reach an agreement on limiting existing armaments, nor provided for compulsory arbitration of disputes, but were an important forerunner of the League of Nations. 30. League of Nations. The later years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century were marked by the rise of imperialism, in which the great powers of Europe sought colonies in Africa and Asia, raised conscript armies, and participated in an unending arms race that eventually led to the First World War that killed approximately 20 million people in an orgy of mechanized slaughter. This carnage shocked people to such an extent that they became determined that it must never happen again, the war to end wars. Several organizations were established towards this goal. In the US, a League to Enforce Peace, led by former President William Taft, and in the UK, a League of Nations Society. Leonard Woolf wrote a 2-volume report for the Fabian Society entitled International Government, which foreshadowed many features of the eventual League of Nations. These ideas were taken up by President Woodrow Wilson of the US in a 14 points speech to Congress in 1918. Two of the most important were 4. Adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with absolute safety. 14. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. President Wilson headed a committee at the Peace Convention at Versailles in Paris to establish the League. He was assisted amongst others by the South African General Smuts, S-M-U-T-S, who wrote a practical suggestion which stated that the League of Nations should be more than a possible means of preventing future wars, but much more as a great organ of the ordinary peaceful life of civilization, as the foundation of the new international system which will be erected on the ruins of this war. In 30 hours of committee work, they produced a covenant that became Part 1 of the Treaty of Versailles. The rest of the treaty consisted of the peace settlement imposed on the defeated Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary and Turkey. With hindsight, many feel that the Treaty of Versailles created the seeds that led to the Second World War due to its revenge-based attitudes, particularly towards Germany. The treaty had forgotten the teachings of Grotius. The Central Powers were asked to pay reparations of $32 billion, which was more than they could afford. The Germans were humiliated. They defaulted on their payments in 1923, resulting in the French and Belgians occupying the Ruhr Basin. This was soon followed by the German hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the middle class. The German hatred of Versailles allowed the later rise of Hitler. The first part of the treaty dealt with the Covenant of the League of Nations, which in hindsight was an earlier and smaller version of the United Nations, UN. The treaty as a whole consists of 26 articles. The first 7 dealt with the organization of the League. Its major organs consisted of A. the Assembly, B. the Council, C. the Secretariat, D. the Court. The Assembly consisted of representatives from all the member states and could deal with any matter within the sphere of action of the League. It was the precursor of the General Assembly of the UN. The Assembly met once a year in September as an embryonic world parliament. The Council was to consist of representatives of the victorious great powers, originally taken as the US, Britain, France, Italy and Japan, together with several representatives of lesser powers elected by the Assembly. The Council was the executive of the League and had the primary responsibility for dealing with threats to the peace and drawing up plans for disarmament. It met 3 or 4 times a year, or whenever required to deal with threats to peace. It was the precursor of the Security Council of the UN. The Secretariat provided bureaucratic support for the League and consisted of the Secretary-General and about 600 staff headquartered in Geneva. A permanent court of international justice, successor to the Hague Court, was set up to arbitrate disputes. Each member of the Assembly and the Council had 1 vote, and decisions on matters of substance required the agreement of all members present, the unanimity rule. Matters of procedure could be decided by a majority vote. Articles 8 and 9 of the Covenant dealt with disarmament. The disarmament of Germany was claimed to be only a beginning to more general disarmament among the great powers. Articles 10 to 21 were intended to deal with disputes so as to make disarmament possible. This document was ambitious, to say the least. Article 10 provided a guarantee of the territorial integrity of every member of the League. Article 12 provided for a dispute between members to be submitted to arbitration, and Article 16 discussed the sanctions, including armed force, which might be applied against any nation that broke the covenant. In theory, this should have provided a complete system of common security for all the members of the League. The problem was that the League lacked teeth. There were insufficient practical measures to carry it out or enforce it. The annual budget was a miserly $5.5 million. The Brits paid only a few $100,000 a year. The League was effectively killed by the defection of the US due to the fact that President Wilson was unable to persuade his own political party in the US to agree with his ideas. The US preferred to become isolationist and disassociate itself from Europe's wars that had cost the US so much and with no benefit. The Americans felt that Article 10 would only drag the US into more wars, so the same president who had created the League was forced to abandon it. Soon after, Italy and Japan went fascist, and Germany was not even a member in the early days. That left the UK and France to pay for any military intervention on the part of the League. Both had suffered so much in the war that they were unwilling to go to war again. However, there were some minor successes. The League settled disputes between Finland and Sweden, Greece and Bulgaria, Colombia and Peru. In 1921, Yugoslavia invaded Albania. The League held a council meeting. A Yugoslav loan was made non-negotiable on the London market, and Yugoslav exchange rates fell all over Europe. The Yugoslav troops withdrew. This shows what can be done with sanctions. The League also had some success in economic and social matters. For example, it directed the financial reconstruction of Austria, Hungary and Greece after the war with loans. It organized the relief and repatriation of thousands of prisoners of war and refugees. It combated disease, white slavery and drug trafficking. It set up a system for the ex-colonies of Germany and Turkey and promoted education in the poorer countries. These early good works have been continued by the present UN. With disarmament, however, there was little success. The problem was the eternal disarmament versus security. Article 10 was becoming a dead letter. 31. Briand, or Briand if you emphasize it, B-R-I-A-N-D. Aristide Briand was a French statesman and lawyer who was Premier of France 11 times. He believed that peace could only be assured by reconciliation between France and Germany. He was the leader of the pan-European movement at the time. In 1925, as Foreign Minister of France, he undertook rapprochement with Germany and with others, created the Locarno Pact, which obligated Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Poland and Czechoslovakia to achieve general disarmament. Germany and France renounced the use of war to alter the frontiers between them. The Rhineland was declared a neutral zone, and all disputes were to be settled through the League. In 1928, he and the US Secretary of State agreed to outlaw war entirely. With their Kellogg-Briand Pact, they obliged each signatory to renounce war as an instrument of national policy and to settle all disputes and conflicts by peaceful means. This pact was signed in Paris in 1928. By 1936, it had been accepted by 65 states. But as a practical instrument, it was useless. It failed to prevent the wars that followed later in the 1930s and World War II. But it did change public opinion. It made the general public see war as an outlaw act, rather than as a normal instrument of national policy, as in the days of Machiavelli or Clausewitz. In 1930, Briand circulated a Memorandum on the Organization of a Federal Order of European Union, in which the establishment of the long-awaited United States of Europe was made part of the official foreign policy of France. But by then, the other European powers were not interested. From then on, things got worse. The economic Great Depression came, resulting in greater nationalism and xenophobia. Fascists were in control in Italy and winning power in Japan, and on the rise in Germany. This was all very troublesome for the League. 32. H.G. Wells. Despite, or perhaps because of, the above, the first organised movements for a world government began to surface. H.G. Wells, the famous British science fiction writer, for example, The Time Machine, published his futuristic The World Set Free in 1913, in which he depicted a terrible war fought with atomic bombs. After the Holocaust, the survivors formed a world government which brought an end to war and ushered in an era of unprecedented social and economic progress. In 1933 he published The Shape of Things to Come, that again advertised the virtues of world government and led to the creation of short-lived Wellesian societies around the world. 33. Schwimmer, Lloyd, Streit. In 1937, Rosika Schwimmer and Lola Maverick Lloyd founded the more permanent Campaign for World Government in the US and in the UK. The Federal Union Group was founded in 1938. In 1939, the New York Times journalist Clarence Streit published Union Now, in which he advocated a union of the North Atlantic democracies as a deterrent to Hitler and as a prelude to a broader federation. The book sold 300,000 copies, but interest in his ideas was soon swept away by the beginning of World War II. 34. Makiguchi. In Japan in 1930, the Buddhist society, Soka Gakkai, the Society for Value Creation, was founded by Tsunesaburo Makiguchi. The society aims at the abolition of war, promotes global transnationalism and global governance. It's become a powerful group, forming its own political party in the Japanese parliament called the Komeito, or Clean Hands Party. 35. The downfall of the League of Nations. The League met its downfall in a series of events. Firstly, when Japan overran Manchuria in China in 1931. The Chinese appealed to the League Council. The League condemned Japan, so Japan left the League. Since Manchuria was a long way from Europe, France and Britain felt unable to challenge Japan in its own sphere of influence, and the US did nothing. All this effectively defeated the League, but since these events were happening far from Europe, the blow was not seen yet as being fatal. Secondly, when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the Council condemned Italy by imposing sanctions. Italy then also withdrew from the League. The embargo was unsuccessful, and the League was defeated. It then sank quickly into irrelevance. Shortly after, Hitler led Germany into war against the UK and France when he invaded Poland. Ad-libbing now. Actually, the UK and Germany declared war on the UK and France declared war on Germany first. This is for World War II. By this stage, the League was effectively dead and would not be revived until the creation in a new form by the United Nations, UN. Why did the League fail? What was missing were effective mechanisms to ensure security if a nation gave up its arms. Also lacking were the resources to ensure such security. What was needed that did not exist was a complete system of international law and government. No member of the League took up arms to defend another member until 1939, nor did the Council even recommend such an action. 36. United Nations, UN. World War II resulted in some 55 million deaths, at least, depending on how you define World War II. Once again, attempts were made to prevent another major war. The United Nations, UN, was created in 1945. At the same time, movements began that led to the development of the European Union, EU. This time, more attention was paid to Grotius. The Allies dealt generously with the defeated Germans. For example, the Marshall Plan that helped Germany and Europe get back on its feet after the war, and to discourage those countries from siding with the communists. This resulted in Germany becoming a democracy and keeping the peace. What did fundamentally change as a result of World War II was the awesome power of the new nuclear bomb, which had the power, with a few kilograms of enriched uranium, to destroy a whole city. For example, Hiroshima, where one bomb killed about 130,000 people. The world's citizens were horrified at the prospect of a nuclear war that could wipe out the whole of humanity. Hence the need to find peaceful solutions to the world's problems became urgent. As a result, schemes for peace and disarmament poured forth. Movements for nuclear disarmament, pacifist movements, and the movement for world government were closely bound. 37. Einstein. One of the most prominent scientists associated with these movements was the 20th century's most famous figure, namely Albert Einstein, a household name around the world. He worked for international peace and understanding all his life. Ironically, when he was forced to flee his Germany in the 1930s for America, he realized that Hitler would probably have to be resisted with force. He signed a letter that was sent to President Roosevelt, persuading him to develop the nuclear bomb that he and other physicists realized would probably soon be made, and that it would be far better if the US got it first before Hitler. Einstein was shocked by the awesome power of the bomb and campaigned against its military use for the rest of his life. 38. Leo Szilard. A contemporary and friend of Einstein's was Leo Szilard, a Hungarian/British/American cosmopolite who persuaded Einstein to write his famous letter to Roosevelt. Szilard organized the Federation of American Scientists, FAS, which was aimed at preventing any future nuclear war. An emergency committee of atomic scientists was set up as a front and fundraiser for the FAS, with Einstein as chairman. They issued a telegram that contained the words, "We scientists who unleash this immense power have an overwhelming responsibility in this world's life and death struggle to harness the atom for the benefit of mankind and not for humanity's destruction." In Einstein's view, the only solution to the problem lay in the formation of a world government, and he campaigned for this goal whenever he could. 39. World Federalist Movement. In the immediate post-World War II period, the movement for world government reached heights that had not been seen either before nor since. A string of publications and books appeared. For example, a US presidential candidate, Wendell Willkie, published a book entitled One World, which sold 2 million copies. The journalist Emery Reeves, in English, sounds French, wrote The Anatomy of Peace, which became the Bible of the world government movement. It attacked nationalism and national sovereignty and argued the need for universal democratic institutions to administer universal law. He stated that war takes place whenever and wherever non-integrated social units of equal sovereignty come into contact. Peace is law, it is order, it is government. He scorned the US as hopelessly inadequate to the task. The leaders of the world government movement in the US included people such as Granville Clark, a lawyer, Norman Cousins, a literary review editor and author of One World or None, Alan Cranston, who became a long-serving senator from California, and Robert Hutchins, Chancellor of the University of Chicago, where a preliminary draft of a world constitution was developed. Organizations were developed such as Americans United for World Government, World Federalists, USA, and Student Federalists. These all flourished and merged in 1947 to form the United World Federalists, whose aim was mainly to strengthen the UN into a world government. Its first president, Cord Meyer Jr., wrote a book called Peace or Anarchy. The membership of this umbrella organization rose to nearly 50,000 by 1949. In the US, 22 states passed resolutions endorsing world government. In the House of Representatives, 91 members introduced a resolution supporting world government as the fundamental objective of US foreign policy. In a poll in 1946, 63% of Americans were in favor of world government, as against 20% opposed. 40. Bertrand Russell. A similar story occurred in the UK. One of the leaders of the British effort was the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who together with Henry Osborne, USBORNE, a member of Parliament, founded a parliamentary group for world government consisting of some 80 members in the House of Commons. Russell also organised a crusade for world government, which reached 15,000 members by 1950. 41. World Federalist movements in other countries. Similar movements sprang up all over Europe and all over the world. For example, in India, Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru endorsed the idea. Nehru stated, "Exactly what are we trying to do by atomic warfare? I cannot for the moment think of any objective which would not be swept away by a billion people being destroyed or disabled." The world, in spite of its rivalries and hatreds and inner conflicts, moves inevitably towards closer cooperation and the building up of a world commonwealth. It is for this one world that free India will work. End quote. 42. Movement for European Federation. In France, World Federalist ideas were endorsed by intellectuals such as Albert Camus, André Gide, and Jean-Paul Sartre. A registry of world citizens reached 500,000 by 1950. Some 400 communities in France, Belgium,